The bustling streets of downtown Chicago were alive with the hum of city life. Pedestrians hurried past food carts and street performers, their eyes glued to their phones or focused on their destinations. Among them was a man sitting on the sidewalk, his back against a brick wall. His clothes were tattered, his face weathered, and a worn-out cardboard sign rested at his feet. It read, "Homeless Veteran. Anything helps." God bless, a few feet away, a reporter named Claire Bennett adjusted her microphone, her cameraman ready to roll. Claire was known for her sharp wit and unapologetic takes on social issues. Today, she was filming a segment on urban homelessness, but her tone was far from compassionate. "Let's see what this guy has to say," Claire muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She approached the man, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her tone overly sweet. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" The man looked up, his eyes tired but kind. "Sure," he said softly. Claire smirked, turning to the camera. "Here we have another example of the American dream," she said, her voice laced with mockery. "Living on the streets, begging for change. Tell me, sir, how did you end up here?" The man hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. I served in the military," he said, "but when I came home, things fell apart. I lost my job, my family, everything." Claire raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening. "Oh, a veteran, huh? That's convenient. Did you also lose your sense of responsibility?" The crowd that had gathered gasped, their murmurs growing louder. The man's face flushed, but he remained calm. "I did my best," he said quietly, "but sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan." Claire laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Well, maybe you should have planned better," she said, turning back to the camera. "This is what happens when people don't take accountability for their—" Before she could finish, a voice cut through the noise. "Claire Bennett, is it?" Everyone turned to see a tall man in a suit stepping forward. His face was stern, his eyes blazing with anger. Claire froze, her smirk fading. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" the man demanded. Claire blinked, confused. "What are you—" "This," the man said, pointing to the homeless veteran, "is Colonel James Carter. He served 3 tours overseas, saved countless lives, and was honorably discharged. And this is how you treat him?" The crowd erupted into gasps and whispers. Claire's face turned pale, her microphone slipping from her hand. The crowd fell silent, their eyes darting between Claire, the man in the suit, and the homeless veteran. Claire's face was pale, her earlier confidence replaced by a look of sheer panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man in the suit stepped closer, his voice firm and commanding. "Colonel James Carter served this country for over 20 years, he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. He was deployed 3 times, led missions that saved lives, and came home with injuries that left him unable to work. And instead of honoring his sacrifice, you mock him." Claire stammered, her hands trembling. I didn't know," she said weakly. "Of course you didn't," the man shot back. "Because you didn't bother to ask. You saw a man on the street and decided he was less than human. That's not journalism, that's cruelty." The crowd murmured, their disapproval growing louder. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. James, the veteran, sat quietly, his eyes downcast. He had not asked for this. He had not wanted to be the center of attention. The man in the suit turned to James, his expression softening. "Colonel Carter," he said, his voice respectful, "I'm General Mark Harris. I served with your unit in Afghanistan. I know what you've been through, and I'm sorry you had to endure this." James looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. General Harris knelt down, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "We're going to get you the help you need. A place to stay, medical care, and a job. You have my word." The crowd erupted into applause, their earlier judgment replaced by admiration and respect. Claire stood frozen, her microphone dangling from her hand. She had come here to film a story, but she had become the story. As the cameras continued to roll, Claire finally found her voice. I'm sorry, she said, her tone barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. Save it. General Harris interrupted, his voice cold. Your apology doesn't change what you did, but maybe it'll make you think twice before judging someone again. With that, he helped James to his feet, the crowd parting to let them through. Claire stood alone, the weight of her actions sinking in. She had come to expose a problem, but in the end, she had exposed herself. As General Harris led James away, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Claire Bennett stood frozen, her mind racing. The cameraman lowered his equipment, his expression a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Claire, he said hesitantly, we need to talk about this. Claire did not respond. Her eyes were fixed on the spot where James had been sitting just moments ago. The crumpled cardboard sign still lay on the ground. Its words, homeless veteran, anything helps, God bless, now haunting her. She had come here to film a segment, to expose what she saw as a systemic issue. But in her rush to make a point, she had forgotten the most important part of journalism, humanity. She had not asked James his story. She had not cared to know who he was or what he had been through. She had seen only a stereotype, not a person. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, suffocating. She thought of the countless times she had mocked others on air, her sharp tongue cutting through their dignity. She had always told herself it was for the sake of truth, for the sake of holding people accountable. But now, she was not so sure. Claire, the cameraman said again, his voice firmer this time. We need to address this. The footage. It's already going viral. Claire finally looked at him, her face pale. What do you mean? He held up his phone, showing her the notifications flooding in. Social media was ablaze with clips of the encounter. The hashtag #sign James Carter was trending, and the comments were brutal. Shame on Claire Bennett. This is why we need to listen before we judge. Colonel Carter deserves better. Claire's hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was crumbling before her eyes. But then she saw something that stopped her cold. A comment from a veterans advocacy group. This is a wake-up call for all of us. Let's not just criticize Claire. Let's do better. Let's help James and others like him. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd. People were still gathered nearby, their faces a mix of anger and curiosity. She knew she had a choice. She could walk away, or she could face the consequences of her actions. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. Everyone, she said, her voice shaky but loud enough to be heard, I need to say something. The crowd turned to her, their expressions wary. Claire swallowed hard, her heart pounding. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on Claire. She stood there, her microphone still in hand, but for the first time in her career she felt utterly exposed. The weight of their stares was almost too much to bear, but she knew she had to say something. I owe you all an apology, Claire began, her voice trembling. Especially to James Carter. I was wrong, I was cruel, and I let my own biases cloud my judgment. She paused, her breath shaky, and looked down at the ground. The crumpled cardboard sign was still there, a stark reminder of her mistake. I came here today to tell a story, but I forgot the most important part of storytelling, listening. I didn't ask James who he was or what he had been through. I didn't see him as a person, and for that, I am deeply sorry, the crowd murmured, their expressions softening slightly. Some nodded, while others crossed their arms, still skeptical. Claire knew she had a long way to go to earn their trust, but she was determined to try. I also want to apologize to anyone who has ever felt invisible or judged, she continued, her voice growing stronger. No one deserves to be treated the way I treated James today, and I promise you, I will do better. She turned to her cameraman, who was still filming. Turn that off, she said firmly. This isn't about me anymore. It's about James and people like him who need our help. The cameraman hesitated but eventually lowered the camera. Claire stepped closer to the crowd, her hands clasped in front of her. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I do want to make things right. Starting today, I'm donating my salary for the next 6 months to organizations that support homeless veterans, and I'm going to use my platform to tell their stories, not as a reporter, but as someone who's finally ready to listen." The crowd erupted into applause, their earlier anger replaced by cautious hope. Claire felt a lump in her throat as she realized this was just the beginning. She had a lot of work to do, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. As the crowd began to disperse, Claire noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the group. It was General Harris, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of her apology. Claire nodded back, her heart pounding. She knew this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Claire Bennett. Her apology had gone viral, sparking a wave of support for James Carter and homeless veterans across the country. Donations poured into organizations dedicated to helping veterans, and Claire's promise to donate her salary was met with both praise and skepticism. But Claire was determined to prove she was serious. She reached out to General Harris, who agreed to help her connect with veterans' advocacy groups. Together, they organized a fundraiser, with all proceeds going toward housing, medical care, and job training for homeless veterans. The event was held in a community center, its walls adorned with photos of veterans and their stories. Claire stood at the podium, her hands trembling as she looked out at the crowd. Among them was James Carter, now clean-shaven and dressed in a crisp suit. He had been given a temporary home and was receiving the care he needed, thanks to the outpouring of support. "Thank you all for being here," Claire began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't about me. It's about James and the countless others like him who have sacrificed so much for our country. It's about giving them the respect and support they deserve." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "I made a terrible mistake, but I'm grateful for the chance to make things right, and I hope this event is just the beginning of a larger conversation about how we treat our veterans and our homeless population." The crowd erupted into applause, their support palpable. James stood up, his eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Claire," he said, his voice strong and clear. "Thank you for listening." Claire smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "No, James," she said. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." As the event continued, Claire made her way through the crowd, shaking hands and listening to stories. She felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. For the first time in her career, she was using her platform not to criticize or mock, but to uplift and inspire. But as the night wore on, Claire knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many stories to be told, and she was ready to tell them. Months after the fundraiser, the impact of Claire's actions continued to ripple across the country. The event had raised over $1 million, funding housing, medical care, and job training programs for homeless veterans. But the real change was not in the numbers. It was in the stories. James Carter had become a symbol of hope. He had moved into a small apartment, found a job at a local nonprofit, and was rebuilding his life one day at a time. His story inspired others to come forward, sharing their own struggles and triumphs. Claire, too, had changed. She had stepped away from her role as a sensationalist reporter and instead focused on telling stories that mattered. Her new series, Voices of the Invisible, highlighted the lives of homeless veterans, shedding light on their sacrifices and struggles. The series was a hit, not because it was controversial, but because it was real. One evening, Claire sat down with James for an interview. The cameras rolled as they talked about his journey, from the streets to stability. "What would you say to someone who's going through what you went through?" Claire asked, her voice gentle. James smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "I'd tell them to never give up," he said. "There are people out there who care. You just have to let them in." The interview ended with a standing ovation, not just from the audience but from the crew as well. Claire felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She had started this journey seeking redemption, but she had found something far greater: purpose. As the months turned into years, the ripple effect of that fateful day continued to grow. Communities came together to support their veterans, and Claire's work inspired other journalists to tell stories with compassion and respect. But for Claire, the most important change was within herself. She had learned that kindness was not just a virtue, it was a responsibility, and she was determined to live up to it, one story at a time. As she packed up her equipment after the interview, James approached her. "Thank you, Claire," he said, his voice steady. "You've changed my life." Claire smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "No, James," she said, "you changed mine." And in that moment she knew the ripple would never end. As Claire packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. She had found her purpose and she was determined to keep moving forward. But the story does not end here. It is up to all of us to keep the ripple going, to listen before we judge, to see the humanity in everyone, and to act with kindness, even when it is hard. So, what will you do? How will you make a difference in someone's life today? Share your story with us. Let's keep this ripple of kindness alive, one act, one word, one moment at a time. Because the world does not need more critics, it needs more kindness, and it starts with you.